Good evening, good evening, good evening. This is just really a call to order. We just thank everyone for joining us this evening. What a beautiful evening in the rain. A beautiful fall evening. And it's so great that so many of you made it out here. We have over 100 people online right now. We have 300 registered online, so we know they're going to be coming in and coming in. And so without further ado, I would like to bring up to do our opening remarks Lisa Williams-George, Director of Equity, Inclusion, and Transformative Practices at the Victoria University at the University of Toronto in the building that you're sitting in. Please give a warm welcome to Lisa.
So good evening and welcome. I am Lisa Williams-George, and I'm here to bring greetings to you, warm greetings to you on behalf of Dr. Rhonda McEwen to this inspirational town hall for the inspirational gathering for the National Black Justice Town Hall. So before I get started, I just want to acknowledge some of our key people that are in the room with us today. So I want to acknowledge Senator Bernadette Clement, retired Judge Pam Applet, and the Honorable Harold Lovell, Ray Williams, the chairman of the Black Opportunities Fund. So, and to all our community guests and members and all those who worked on this inspirational landmark document, welcome to Victoria University. So, as an alumni of Victoria University, I feel a deep connection with this place and the space, and it's an ideal space for equity and justice, and it has been long nurtured here. It's especially meaningful to me that we gather here at this institution that has shaped so many people and so many things in the past, to have the critical conversation about justice for Black Canadians. The value of inclusivity and transformative changes that we will discuss today resonates deeply within the core of what Victoria University stands for. So a couple of pieces, so you know where you are, and I want to center us and center the space. Did you know that in 1884 that Victoria became one of the first Canadian universities to allow women to enroll in full degree programs? Very progressive move. Probably that's, right? Probably the reason why I came here as an undergraduate, because of the progressiveness of Victoria. And as well, in 1890, one of the first colleges to become a part of the affiliated, federated colleges within the University of Toronto. Couple more. One of the first places to offer theological education in Emmanuel College, which has an affiliation with the United Church of Canada and works very hard on the truth and reconciliation for Indigenous folks, and is a multi-faith organization bestowing doctorates, divinity, ministry, and preaching doctorates onto undergraduates here at Victoria. And recently, the installation of Dr. Rhonda McEwen, one of the most amazing people I know, and the first Black female president of a Canadian university in history, right here. And recently, we became the signatories of the Scarborough Charter on Anti-Black Racism and Inclusion in Canadian Education, its principal actions and accountabilities. There are about 50 universities that have signed on, and Victoria is one of those. So this evening, we mark yet another significant milestone here at Vic as we host this town hall and discussion for the roadmap for transformative change, Canada's Black Justice Strategy. And this report represents more than just a document. It's a comprehensive comprehensive roadmap that addresses the systemic inequities, faced by Black communities and outline actionable recommendations for real change. It's critical that the contents of the roadmap for transformative change spark widespread discussion that lead to transformative action. We also want to ensure that these recommendations move beyond this room and into the policies and practices that shape our institutions, our government, our society, our community, and our country. This is our call to action, to advocate that the governmental recognition and implementation of these recommendations and to continue pushing forward with urgency and accountability. Thank you for being here as a part of this important, most well-meaning and long-time coming conversation, and welcome you again to Victoria University. And I'm looking forward to the insightful discussion that it lays ahead of you. But before I leave, it's my honor to introduce our Indigenous Knowledge Keeper, Michael China, from the Toronto Council Fire Native Cultural Center, who will lead us through an Indigenous welcome and smudging ceremony. Please join me in welcoming Michael Chena. Thank you.
My name is Michael Chena. I'm a survivor of the residential school system. I attended two residential schools from 1958 to 1968. I grew up in a Cree community on Treaty 9 territory along the shores of James Bay, formerly known as Rupert's Land. So I'll start off with the land acknowledgement. We would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Huron Wendat, and most recently, the Mississaugas of Credit First Nation. The territory was the subject of the dish with one spoon, wampum belt, covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. This territory is also covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. Today, the meeting place of Toronto, from the Haudenosaunee word Takaranto, is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. In 2015, the federal Liberals campaigned on a platform to reform government policy and achieve justice for Indigenous communities. The TRC report focused on education, child welfare, health, and justice issues. There were 4 levels of reconciliation: individual level, community level, institutional level, and government level. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission's mandate was to educate and inform Canadians on the legacy of Indian residential schools and to help promote reconciliation. Calls to action number 30 and number 38 refer to eliminating the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in custody, federally and provincially. Indigenous peoples are often victims of racial profiling, arbitrary and discriminatory arrests, and disproportionate use of force by law enforcement personnel. Native people in Canada are distinct nations with duly recognized treaty and constitutional rights. There is nothing more important than our treaties, our lands, and the well-being of our future generations. The doctrine of discovery established a spiritual, political, and legal justification for colonization and seizure of land not inhabited by Christians. The doctrine of discovery continues to impact the Indigenous peoples throughout the world. The Indian Act holds the land in trust for the Crown. Generations of First Nations families became stateless people as a result of legislated governmental policy or assimilation. The Canadian flag is a symbol of pluralism and prosperity. but also of Indigenous oppression and racial injustice. The historical nation-to-nation relationship has been marred in colonialism and conflict. Reconciliation means acknowledging historical injustices, a broken relationship, and taking action to end colonialism. In 2010, Canada endorsed the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Mainstream society keeps reiterating that these are Canadian taxpayers' dollars, when in fact those dollars are revenues generated from Indigenous lands and resources. White privilege and systemic racism continue to be significant issues for the Indigenous people of Canada. All my relations. Miigwech. Thank you, Creator, that we are able to walk on Mother Earth this day. Miigwech. All my relations.
Good evening. I'd like to thank Michael Chena, our Indigenous Knowledge Keeper, for that beautiful and heartfelt welcome. As a person of African descent, I acknowledge also the shared history of our two peoples, of bondage on these lands, and the resulting generational trauma. The First Nations people who had their land stolen from their ancestors, and Africans whose ancestors were stolen from their lands. So as we come together here to discuss policy solutions to interrupt long-standing systemic racism against Black people in Canada, it is important that we also center this convening with an acknowledgement of our ancestors of African origin and descent, in particular, those who came here forcibly as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. We acknowledge also the elders and community stalwarts on whose shoulders we stand, who fought incessantly and tirelessly to make this time and this space we're in possible. Welcome, and thank you for participating in Black Opportunity Fund's National Townhall to discuss the recommendations for the foundation of a Black justice strategy. Justice is a key focus area for Black Opportunity Fund. Our National Justice Working Group has provided input to help inform the development of the justice strategy, including a series of recommendations to the steering committee framed around restorative and reparatory justice for Black people in Canada. As the steering committee's recommendations are now under consideration by government, we feel it is important to convene a national community discussion to provide insights into the steering committee's process, outline the key recommendations, and facilitate an opportunity for engagement with community members. We are pleased to have this evening Professor Akwasi Owosubempa, sorry about that, and Zilla Jones, the co-authors of A Roadmap for Transformative Change, Canada's Black Justice Strategy, as well as members of BOF's Justice Working Group from across the country, to help us understand and interrogate the recommendations, the potential government response, and the implications for restorative and reparatory justice. Justice Minister Arif Virani unfortunately couldn't attend with us here in person today, but he has sent a video message, which I invite you to join me in watching now.
Hello, bonjour. Greetings from my office in Ottawa, which is situated on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. Thank you so much to the Black Opportunity Fund, the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, and the U of T's Centre for Criminology and Socio-Legal Studies for organizing this important event and for inviting me to share a few words. In June, we reached a significant milestone with the release of the steering group's report, A Roadmap for Transformative Change. Our government is deeply grateful to the report authors, Zilla Jones and Akwasi Owosubempa, and everyone on the steering group for your exemplary leadership and your dedication to this history-making report. We handed you a very ambitious timeline, and you delivered a report that presents a vision that is truly transformative, a vision for a justice system that treats all equally, free from discrimination. As part of that process, 12 Black-led community-based organizations conducted engagements and consultations with Black communities across the country in fall of 2023. Je tiens à remercier tout le monde qui a pris part à ces activités de consultation et de mobilisation, ainsi que toutes les personnes qui ont courageusement partagé leur douloureuse expérience de racisme envers les personnes noires et ses profondes conséquences. À ces personnes, je dis, nous vous avons entendu haut et fort. Les réalités que vous avez partagées nous servent de guide alors que nous allons de l'avant pour transformer notre système de justice. I know the ball is in our court. I appreciate your patience as our government reviews the recommendations and determines the best course forward. The changes that are needed to address these issues will take time. They must encompass the full range of government responsibilities. They must also take into consideration the social determinants of justice, areas like education, employment, housing, health and mental health, all of which play a vital role in who gets swept into the criminal justice system. It will take time, but we remain committed to starting implementation this year, and I look forward to updating you on the next phases of this work soon. Know that this is more than a mandate priority for me. As a racialized person, it is deeply personal. Black people should not have to fight for their charter rights to be honored. Black people deserve equal treatment before and under the law in this country. I will do everything I can in my role to ensure our collective efforts are a catalyst for real and transformative change for Black communities in Canada. Thank you again, sincerely, for your invaluable work. En travaillant ensemble sur plusieurs plans, nous pouvons rendre le système de justice pénale du Canada plus accessible et plus juste pour tout le monde. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
I'd now like to invite to say a few words Professor Kamari Clark, who's Distinguished Professor of Transnational Justice and Director, Center for Criminology and Socio-Legal Studies, as well as Professor Beatrice Jiregi, U of T Associate Professor, Center for Criminology and Sociological Studies, Socio-Legal Studies, Chair, Research Cluster for the Study of Racism and Inequality, who are co-hosting this event with BOF today, along with the Canadian Race Relations Foundations. Professors?
Hello and welcome. Wonderful to see everyone here. Lots of familiar faces. On behalf of the Center for Criminology and Socio-Legal Studies here at the University of Toronto, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to everyone here in this hall and also those online, the dignitaries present, our university community, members of the Black communities, and our dear allies. We welcome you all. CRIMSL is a research and teaching center that fosters critical engagement in some of the most pressing questions of our time. What is crime? Who is classified as a criminal? What are the impacts of criminalization? And how can we understand the nexus between law, society, justice, and violence in a complex world? The research at the center, conducted by faculty, visiting scholars, researchers, students, spans a range of local, national, and international domains. It highlights social, economic, national, and racial disparities. and examines governance and justice issues, especially as they relate to policing, racism, incarceration, migration, constitutionalism, as well as law and legal institutions. With commitments to mobilizing innovative, interdisciplinary scholarship that can help us to imagine and forge pathways to equitable futures, we hold dear to us a commitment to knowledge and knowledge production, as well as real possibilities for social change. And it's in this spirit that the report that we're here to discuss today, A Roadmap for Transformative Change, Canada's Black Justice Strategy, speaks to the importance of participating in the development of new policies, new visions, and new possibilities that can provide a template for real and substantive change in Canada. The conversations tonight, of course, will offer us a wonderful opportunity to engage further and shed light on some of the most consequential issues of our time. Congratulations, of course, to the authors of this bold and critically important roadmap. Thank you all who participated in the consultations, and of course, thank you to our co-hosts, and welcome to you all. I'd like to now turn to my colleague, Professor Jauregui, to welcome you on behalf of the Center's most important and recent initiative, and that is the Research Cluster for the Study of Racism and Inequality.
Thank you, Kamari, and a warm welcome to everyone on behalf of the Research Cluster for the Study of Racism and Inequality. The cluster focuses on collaborating with community members to identify the gaps, the failures, and the successes of decades of equity initiatives, and to develop transformative strategies to improve justice and security for all. We offer a new platform for sharing and building knowledge by and for Black, Indigenous, and racialized scholars and communities in Canada and internationally. With support from the University of Toronto over the past 4 years, we've established a network of alliances between scholars and multiple community organizations by supporting 17 research projects in Canada, but also in Mexico, Peru, South Africa, and several Indigenous territories here on Turtle Island. We are kicking off a fundraising campaign for the cluster, since we're confident that with continued support, we can build on existing programs that share collaborative knowledge that will have a strong impact. This National Townhall exemplifies exactly the kind of work that the cluster will continue to do, and we are honored to co-sponsor this event and support the conversation. I'll now invite to say a few words Fatma Hassan, who's the Public Policy Director from the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, who are also co-hosting this event. Thank you.
Can everyone hear me? Yes. All right. Thank you, Professors Kamari Clark and Beatrice Jauregui. I said it right? Perfect. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Fatma Hassan, and it is an honor to be here with all of you today and to see faces of friends, community members, and colleagues. And thank you to the Black Opportunity Fund for bringing us all together for this important and timely town hall, and to all of you in this room who have gathered to contribute your wisdom and your experience in this space. The Canadian Race Relations Foundation is very honored to be supporting today's discussion. Congratulations to Zilla, Akwazi, and the 9-member steering committee from across the country that contributed to the creation of the Roadmap for Transformative Change, Canada's Black Justice Strategy, that calls on the federal government to respond and implement the 114 recommendations. So a round of applause to them for all the steering committee members. So over a year ago, in May 2023, alongside our partners at CC UNESCO, the CRF coordinated a delegation of 20+ brilliant minds to participate in the second session of the Permanent Forum for People of African Descent in NYC, and some of those familiar faces are here today, and some of them will be up speaking shortly. The discussions, meetings, and side events focus on addressing systemic and institutional racism that harms people of African descent in its various forms, including within the justice system. Earlier this year, we released a report about the experience in NYC. The report is called Reflections on the First Decade, Black Canadian Leadership at the UN Forum for People of African Descent. And again, it was authored by some of the people here in this room today that are also part of the steering committee. The report summarized the important work, the meetings held at the second session and the meetings held in the second session in 2023. One of the recommendations we made was the support for the creation of the National Institute for People of African Descent. And on August 30th, we welcome the federal government's announcement on the creation of the Institute. And amongst us today is Floyd Dean, who is going to be leading that institute. So again, round of applause. We recognize and understand that doing this transformative work that you're all doing is challenging. The CRF is committed to continuing its support on issues that advance and push for justice for Black communities and looks forward to the federal government's forthcoming response to the seminal report we're here to discuss today. And with that, I'd like to introduce you to the speakers, Zella Jones and Akwazi Owusu-Bempah.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for the introduction. And I just want to start with a number of thank yous. Thank you, first of all, for being here today. I want to thank all of the people who contributed to us getting to where we are now with respect to the report itself, as we'll talk about in just a moment. We're certainly standing on the shoulders of giants in terms of what it is that we delivered. But importantly, we need to recognize that what it is that we document, not only in our final report, but in the framework for Canada's Black Justice Strategy, of course, reflects the lives and experiences of people who look much like us, right? The figures are not simply numbers. The stories are not simply stories. This is a reflection of the lives that we lead. Thank you again to our sponsors and co-sponsors. Thank you for Vic for hosting us here. And thank you, Zilla, for putting up with me throughout this process. And on that note, I'm going to pass things over to you to get us started.
Good evening, everybody. I echo my appreciation. Whenever I stand in front of a room like this, the first thing I think is that my grandmother would not have been able to do something like this. My mother didn't have the opportunity to do something like this. I'm here because I stand on their shoulders. I know all of us here stand on our elders' shoulders, our ancestors' shoulders. So I'm just always very humbled and grateful for that. So I thank the Department of Justice for asking us to do the work. And then for the people that invited us here today, the Black Opportunities Fund, Race Relations Foundation, they helped us go to the United Nations and be part of that. And of course, the University of Toronto and Victoria College, thank you. So we have a PowerPoint. I don't know if that's live. So I was just gonna start with a little bit about the origins of how this strategy came to be. So the direct impetus for it was in 2021. The Prime Minister gave the Attorney General and Minister of Justice for Canada the mandate to develop the CBJS. And it was in partnership with the Minister of Housing, Inclusion and Diversity, and in consultation with Black communities. That piece is really important, and we'll be coming back to that over and over. Because as most people in this room will know, Black communities have been fighting for justice across Canada long before the CBJS and long after there'll be a CBJS. But we know that in 2020, when George Floyd was murdered, there was protests and a lot of awareness that happened after that. So then this year, Canada has extended that decade to 2028 so that we will get a full decade. So we're still about halfway through that here in Canada. And so this decade really focuses on people in the African diaspora and how our lives can be improved. In 2017, a UN working group came to Canada to look specifically at African Canadians, and they reported that they had some deep concerns. Although Canada was doing a number of things well, there were a number of injustices, including in the criminal justice system. And so that was in that report that you can still find online. Amnesty International has reported several times on anti-Black racism as recently as this year, and they're still finding that in things that are happening in Canada. And then, of course, as I said, Black people have been resisting injustice since first touching these shores. Some famous Black resistors include Marie-Joseph Angelique, 1734 in Montreal, who was an enslaved person. She was accused of burning the city. She was tortured and hanged by the justice system for something she may not have done. Chloe Cooley in 1793 is credited with the end of enslavement in Canada because she was kidnapped by her former owner in the United States and dragged across the river. She was screaming out for help as she went across the river. Black communities protested that and went to the governor's residence and said, why are you allowing people to be taken back to slavery in the United States? Canada decided to phase out slavery. Fred Christie was famous for the Christie versus York criminal case that some of you may have read if you ever went to law school. And that was a case in Quebec where the Supreme Court of Canada actually said that a bar doesn't have to serve a Black person if they don't want to because it's up to them who they serve. That was a law in Canada till fairly recently. Viola Desmond, many of you will know about her from Nova Scotia. She went to jail for sitting in the wrong section of a movie theater because it was a whites only section. And she was only recently pardoned. And Smithers in 1973, another case that we learned in law school, was an individual who was a Black teenager who got into a fight at a hockey game because he was being called the N-word. And they had this whole case about the causation of the murder of the person that he fought, and almost nothing said about the racial slurs, although that was a big part of that case. So this is a long-standing issue in the Canadian justice system, long before the CBJS. I think Kwasi's going to talk about some of these past reports.
We're going to do the dance.
Yeah.
We're going to dance back and forth. We practiced. As noted, the struggle has been a long one, and it's important for us to recognize as well that not only have individuals, communities, organizations been struggling, but as I mentioned, you know, our work really, we are standing on the shoulders of giants, and we have now innumerable reports, the results of inquiries and commissions that have pointed to much the same thing time and time again, right? We've got reports going back now decades that have examined the extent to which racism exists in our society generally and within the criminal justice system in particular. Some of those reports have focused on specific practices recently in the GTA and other areas, of course, issues related to police carding. We've noted here work done by the correctional investigator in the context of federal corrections. Probably the most comprehensive piece of work relating to the Black experience was the Commission on Systemic Racism in the Ontario Criminal Justice System, whose final report was published in 1995. And so one of the things that we wanted to ensure that we were doing was, again, building upon this work and trying to table a series of recommendations that hopefully wouldn't simply sit on a shelf like so many recommendations that have come before, and also weren't too piecemeal. And we'll talk a little bit more in terms of the strategy that we took with respect to our recommendations when we get to that stage. I'll move over. Too bad the mic's not in the middle, eh?
Yeah, that would help. So when we get to CBJS specifically, it was organized and supported by the Department of Justice. So the team there is all Black people working on this, or majority, which is really important to note. So this is coming from community even at that level. And they are very passionate about the work, and it's more than just a job to the people at Justice. They have been really phenomenal in supporting us. But they did not write the strategy. They did not have any say in what went into it. That was not for them to decide. They just supported what we were doing, provided assistance. There was a steering group made of members that were invited by the Minister of Justice. The steering group was to represent Black Canadians from coast to coast to coast. Some are lawyers, some are not lawyers, but have other experience working in the justice system. Those members' names are here. So there's Fernando Belton, who's from Quebec, does criminal law mostly. Vanessa Fells from Nova Scotia, works for the African Nova Scotia Justice Institute. Mandela Couette is from Manitoba. He runs a program for youth at risk from the Black community. Sandra Muchakeza is a lawyer from Alberta. Anthony Morgan, probably some of you know from here in Toronto, lawyer, does a whole bunch of different things. Suzanne Tuffo is a Quebec immigration lawyer. And Moya Teklu, some of you may also know from Toronto, who's worked for Legal Aid and worked for a number of different justice-related organizations. And then the two of us were the two co-authors, and we also sat on the steering group. There's just some pictures of some of us. So the CBJS was launched in Ottawa during Black History Month 2023. So you heard the minister talk about the short turnaround. That was the short turnaround. So we all flew into Ottawa, met each other for the first time, and got started on the work. So the steering group started meeting monthly online after that. From March to February, we had that short timeline. During those meetings, we discussed each pillar of the CBJS, and we'll tell you the pillars in a second. The steering group provided examples, sources, and concerns from their own experience, reports they had read, things they thought we should look into. Justice staff took notes and gave all that to us, so we had very comprehensive notes of all those discussions. And then Black community groups were contracted to consult with their members and those in their community on those topics that were discussed in the steering group. And then all of this was compiled into the report. So we had thousands of pages. These are the Black community groups from coast to coast to coast. I just wanted to acknowledge them. I know some of them may be represented here, some are online. So in Nova Scotia, we had the African Nova Scotian Justice Institute. I know Dorico's here from that group, and you'll be hearing from him. From the Northwest Territories, we had a Black Advocacy Coalition back up north. For New Brunswick, we had Black Lives Matter New Brunswick. From Quebec, we had Clinique Juridique de Saint-Michel, and also the DESTA Black Community Network. I think one's in Montreal, one's Quebec City. And then from Manitoba, we had Hood Fams, which is Mandela's organization. From British Columbia, the Asamba Center. From Ontario, Jaku Convent, and also Network for the Advancement of Black Communities, and also Think Twice. Some from Ottawa, some from Toronto. And then Saskatchewan, the Truly Alive Youth and Family Foundation Incorporated. We also received submissions. Oh, an AEECEC from Edmonton should be on there as well. I know Dunia's there from that, the African Canadian Civic Engagement Council. Did I get that right? So they also were present.
Yeah, and just to note, these organizations were instrumental in helping us reach, again, people on the ground. We had representation on the steering committee from across the country, from many places across the country, and some of the community organizations that contributed were represented on that steering committee. But as part of the work that was undertaken, of course, there were a series of consultations led at one level by the Department of Justice with a widely distributed survey. And then each of the community organizations held a series of consultations themselves within their own jurisdictions to enable us to hear from, not everybody, of course, but a selection of people with lived experience with the criminal justice system.
And their work was really at the heart of the report. It was hugely important to hear those voices from people that have been incarcerated, that have worked with incarcerated people in each region, because things are a little different in every region. And we wanted to capture that. We don't hear from Black people in Northwest Territories very much. It was really important to hear from them and not just the bigger centers. We also received submissions from the Black Legal Action Centre in Toronto, from Black Opportunities Fund, Canadian Association of Black Lawyers, Canadian Race Relations Foundation, and Groupe d'Action et de Défense contre les Abus Policiers from Montreal. So we had some guiding principles of the CBJS that all of us as a group agreed we would be guided by throughout our work. The principle of Sankofa, that comes from the Twi people of Ghana. And it's basically a principle of looking forward and also looking backwards. So you bring what you've learned from the past into the future to continue the work. Afrocentrism, which is centering Black people in everything you do. The principle of restraint, so that's from criminal law, and means that you look for the least punishment that you can use to achieve your objective. You try to not incarcerate people that you don't need to incarcerate. You use other tools than just imprisonment. Evidence-based decision-making, that's really important in any social science. So we wanted to make sure that we were suggesting things that have been shown to work. There's lots of studies. Kwasi may want to say something about that. But there's lots of studies to build on and see what works, what doesn't work. Reparative justice, you heard about that at the beginning. So really the sense that there are a lot of long-standing injustices that need to be made right, that are broader than just individuals in the system. And until those are fixed, we don't have true justice. And we acknowledged from the beginning that Indigenous and Black liberations are intertwined and often go hand in hand. So I was very happy to see the smudging at the beginning. I don't know if Kwasi wants to say anything about the principle.
Well, just the evidence-based one, is, I think, can folks hear me in the microphone? If I'm standing here, you can. Wonderful. Thank you very much. Going back a moment, the evidence-based one was, of course, key and sensible in the context. But the acknowledgement that the Black liberation and Indigenous liberation are intertwined, right? When we think about the state of racism in our country, when we think about Canada's colonial legacy, undoubtedly Indigenous people have been primary focus, one of the main focuses of the colonial practices that were undertaken and continue to impact on the lives of people within this country. But the very systems, of course, that were set up to control and ultimately, in many ways, physically and culturally annihilate Indigenous peoples, the legal structures, the law enforcement mechanisms that were put in place, also extended to the treatment of Black people. Slavery, of course, being practiced early in Canadian history, and a legal system and structure set up to enable that practice to happen. And so when we think about moving forward with respect to addressing the issues that Black people face in our country and our criminal justice system in particular, we can't move forward with that work without looking to, learning from, and collaborating with Indigenous peoples.
Okay, so then we had 5 priority areas for the strategy. So decarceration was huge. That was really, I think, the genesis for the strategy was the over-incarceration of Black people. And so we requested or demanded, or however you want to put that, but we recommended that overall incarceration in Canada should come down 30% by 2034. We know that Canada is one of the countries that incarcerates some of the most people out of westernized countries. And then we asked for 50% for Black and Indigenous populations, acknowledging that there's over-incarceration, even more so of those populations. So we'd like to see less people in jail 10 years from now. Legislative changes are really important, and we'll talk about those a little bit more in the recommendations, but to the Criminal Code, the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, and more legislation to protect Black employees and people experiencing hate crimes, because we know those are huge issues still in society.
And included in those the priority areas were targeted resourcing. And this was an interesting conversation that we'd often have in our steering group meetings, was talking about, where resources should be allocated, and think about allocating resources, for example, in policing, when we're also having conversations at the same time about defunding policing. With respect to the targeted resourcing, this is really, targeting resources to meet the needs of Black people. Many of these targets were outside of the criminal justice system, as has been noted and will be discussed at length later on, but also within the justice system. And as you'll see when we get to discussing some of the overarching recommendations that really need to drive and push resources to Black communities in order to, create a framework and a structure, a scaffolding around Black communities in this country to allow us to thrive and reduce our contact with the justice system. And this gets to the second, or the fourth point, pardon me, second point I'm making here with respect to the structural change, right? One of the things that we've seen time and time again are attempts at small little tweaks to a system that is doing a very good job of over-criminalizing, over-incarcerating, and unfortunately at times killing us. And so there is a need for deep structural change, deep institutional change. And then again, recognizing that this work came out of a mandate letter from the Prime Minister to the Attorney General or the Minister of Justice, recognizing the need that for a federal initiative to be impactful, considering that much of criminal justice and the issues that are faced by communities are governed by municipalities and governed by provinces and territories, that there was a deep need for collaboration, both within the federal government, but of course, across levels of government as well.
So then we get to the pillars. So the pillars were basically the key areas to focus on. So they are the structure for the strategy. And so we'll go through those pillars. So I think
I'll touch upon them and just at a high level, because some of these will come out in our discussion. And again, for folks that are interested, the Black Justice Strategy report itself is quite lengthy. We do as well have the framework, the Black Justice Strategy framework, which really set out the framework for the work that we were going to undertake. And much of the kind of background in terms of the experience, the data, the statistics that we relied on is contained in that framework. When we came into this work, the main idea was that we were going to focus on the criminal justice system, and we were going to focus on the areas of the criminal justice system that the federal government had kind of control and a mandate over. And one of the things that was apparently clear to many of us on the steering committee is that we cannot address issues within the criminal justice system by focusing solely on the justice system itself. And again, I'm going to talk about this at greater length later on. But in order to address the overrepresentation of people in the justice system, Black people in the justice system and our experiences within that system, we need to understand how it is that we come to be overrepresented. And yes, racial profiling, differences in arrest practices, the use of discretion have an impact. But so too, of course, do our experiences across a variety of areas of society, namely education, employment, housing, child welfare, and has been mentioned before, health and mental health. And without addressing the overrepresentation, underrepresentation, depending on what the outcome is, of Black people in those outcomes, we're never going to be able to address the issues that we see in the justice system to their full extent. Policing was key. Again, thinking about not only the areas of policing that fall within the purview of the federal government, but also thinking about what the provinces and municipalities do. I've just rhymed off a number of kind of findings, facts with respect to Black people's experiences with the police. I don't think that this will be news to any of you. Perhaps I might be offending you by restating some of these things, but we know we are stopped and searched at disproportional rates to our representation in the population. We know that we are more likely to be arrested for doing something that if we were white, we wouldn't necessarily be arrested for, less likely to be given a diversionary program. The quality of our arrests and the charges that are laid are lower. We're more likely to be strip searched, and again, more likely to have force used upon us. And these were the very areas that we were looking to target, as well as considering the experiences of Black law enforcers and other justice officials themselves.
Yeah, so then our third pillar was courts and legislation. So obviously, that's the heart of the day-to-day of the criminal justice system, is what happens in court and the legislation that the judges are using. So the criminal code, as discussed earlier, the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, the Youth Criminal Justice Act, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So there's obviously those documents that are important. And what is important to note in courts and legislation was that it wasn't just about accused persons. So obviously, yes, accused people and the sentences they're getting and their over incarceration was important, but also the experience of other people in the criminal justice system who are Black. So whether that's justice professionals, so representation in the judiciary, representation in the profession, admission to law school, accessibility of law school, availability of legal aid. And also the experience of witnesses and victims, because those are also represented. And we know there's studies showing that Black people are overrepresented in sexual abuse statistics. Black people are overrepresented as murder victims. And we heard from a lot of people who came to court as witnesses and felt that they were discriminated against, there were stereotypes against them, they weren't receiving culturally appropriate treatment. So it's all of that when we talk about courts and legislation, as well as the mandatory minimums, the writing of IRCA reports for Black sentencing, the funding for those. So it's a very broad pillar that included a lot of different aspects.
With respect to corrections, and again, I will share some kind of further information here. One of the things that I find as a researcher who focuses on race in the justice system is that, again, the police make the news a lot, right? Policing is something that is very public. Corrections is quite the opposite, right? People are locked away, and the way in which we treat individuals who are incarcerated is very much to expel them from our society for a period of time. And what happens to them when they're expelled from our society often goes unknown to much of the public. And as I mentioned earlier on, and Zilla had included in our slides here, we have organizations such as the Office of the Correctional Investigator and others who have sought to bring these matters to light. But when we look at things federally, and it's important to recognize that the majority of people who are incarcerated, detained in this country, are done so at the provincial or the territorial level. People who are detained before their trial, who are not released on bail, or who are sentenced to shorter periods of incarceration, make up the majority of prisoners, and so they come under provincial and territorial jurisdiction. Federally, though, we know that while Black people make up, just over 3% or 3% of the population in Canada, we represent between 8 and 9% of the federal prison population, right? Overrepresented at several times our representation in the general population. And this is a statistic that we may see publicly. But treatment in terms of different outcomes within the correctional system often go unknown to people. And it starts really from the moment that someone is sentenced and then subsequently assessed when they arrive at a correctional facility. The risk assessment tools that are used have been demonstrated to be biased, and this has been held up in court for Indigenous people, and many would argue the same is true for Black people. Black people, in comparison to white, are assessed to be at a higher level of risk, which puts them in a higher security classification and placement within the correctional system, which makes it more difficult for them to get access to educational programming and other forms of programming, supports, the very types of activities that an individual would need to undertake to demonstrate that they are rehabilitating themselves, as is purported to happen in our federal correctional system. I'll leave my politics and views aside on that one. But in essence, we get a harsher form of punishment through the security process, the lack of access to, again, programming, and this results in denial of temporary and longer term absences. Black people are more likely to be punished within correctional institutions for engaging in institutional misconduct that is without necessary evidence. So while white people are overrepresented in things like having weapons and drugs, where there's actual concrete evidence that some kind of misconduct has taken place, Black people are overrepresented in those that are disobeying institutional rules. The more discretionary and less evidentiarily grounded forms of discipline. Of course, overrepresented in use of force and in a number of other outcomes as well. And so, of course, corrections was a key focus of our report.
And then the last pillar was parole, reentry, and reintegration. So that one is also really important because that's what we strive for, is for people to do their time and then be able to reintegrate back into society. However, we know that often doesn't happen. People get caught up in the stigma of having a criminal record. We heard a lot about that from the communities that made reports, that people found it very difficult to get housing, get a job when they were released. And so obviously, if we want to break that cycle of crime, then parole, reentry into integration need to work. One thing that we found in our research was that Black prisoners are given lower rates of parole by the parole board, but have lower rates of reoffending. So the Black population is actually one of the lowest group to reoffend once released in federal custody, but gets rated as too high or don't get parole. And so obviously the parole board has some kind of disconnect with what's happening in the community. And what we heard was that a lot of the reasons that people are not reoffending is because the Black community is supporting people really well on the ground with grassroots organizations and community groups and community centers and youth workers and people like that. They're severely under-resourced. So a lot of them who made reports to us, there was, I think, one youth worker was talking about having to pay for their own gas to go and see youth. One of the reports we got that was really helpful was the Saint Michel report from Quebec, because they actually went above and beyond and they got permission to go into the penitentiaries and talk to Black inmates in Quebec. And what they were being told was that a lot of those people couldn't get connected to community groups because the parole officers wouldn't work with them because they want to keep it in-house. And so one of our recommendations was that you need to work with people in the community that have success at helping people turn their life around, and you need to welcome them into the prisons, and you need to be cooperating, collaborating with them instead of keeping them out. A lot of the Quebec prisoners talked about being forced to relocate in Quebec when they don't speak French. So a lot of those kind of things were happening where people were set up to fail. I know Hood Fams talked about that in Manitoba, that a lot of youth on probation felt that they were just being breached right away. The probation officers weren't trying to work with them. They were just treating them as criminals and looking for excuses to lay a breach and have them back in the system. So we really recommended looking at how we assess risk, looking at what's available in terms of resources. A lot of the parole, reentry, and reintegration ties back to social determinants. Because you need to have housing, you need to deal with addictions, you need to deal with mental health, you need to deal with trauma. So that was what that pillar talked about. And then we get to our recommendations, which is, I think, our last piece. Yes. So these are recommendations that the steering group made to the Minister of Justice and Government of Canada in our report. We had short, medium, and long-term goals. So the short-term were things that we expect government should be able to do within the next few months to year. So things like funding IRCA reports. That's not a difficult ask. It's not a lot of money, but it would make an immediate difference if people in every province, there's sort of uneven regimes for what gets funded where. That's a report that goes to the judge when you're sentencing a Black individual that talks about their circumstances dealing with anti-Black racism. We want those to be more available. Medium term were things that might take 5-10 years. So legislation changes, things that maybe need to go get passed through different houses and so on. And then long-term goals, which are things that we understand will take more time, maybe need more resourcing. A lot of the stuff with the social determinants is long-term. I think Kwasi's going to speak about the overarching.
Yeah, I'll speak. So there are 114 recommendations. I got my eye on the time, so I'm not going to read all of them to you, if that's okay. But I do want to just draw attention to a number of overarching recommendations. So again, from the perspective of the steering group and the co-authors, it's one thing to make minor tweaks to a system to, change a law here or a policy or a practice there. And it's something very different to undertake significant kind of institutional and systemic change. And from our perspective, it's that institutional and systemic change that is very much necessary to get us to where it is that we would like to be, or at least on that right path. And so before addressing the recommendations under each of the 5 pillars, social determinants of justice, policing, and so on, we put forth a series of overarching recommendations, and those I am going to read. The first was to establish a centralized federal department or agency necessary to champion and coordinate the efforts and to address the unique challenges of Black people. So establish a federal entity to do such a thing. Establishing a Black justice portfolio within the Department of Justice so that this work can be done in-house, not only by a small group supporting the CBJS, which exists now, but would be a sustained piece of work. Similarly, creating a Black community well-being, importantly well-being and safety division within Public Safety Canada. Some of this work falls to justice, some of it, of course, falls to public safety. Establishing, building on previous recommendations, as we noted earlier, a National Institute for People of African Descent, and we heard about that a little bit earlier on. A unit within Statistics Canada that would be dedicated to the collection of race and identity-based data, right? We cannot fully understand and certainly not address and monitor progress being made without adequate race-based data in this country. Data itself is not going to help us solve the problem, but we need data in order to identify exactly where it is that we need to go and assess our progress in getting there. The decarceration target Zilla's already talking about, recognizing Black people as a distinct group in this country through legislation so that the targeted funding, the resourcing, and the prioritization can happen. Again, we've talked about just how deeply entrenched anti-Black racism is in this country and how it has been, and it is rooted in the foundations of the structure of our society, and that should be recognized by our government. Education and training, and that we pulled this out as an overarching because it falls across each of the pillars as well. And so I would encourage folks that haven't already read the entirety of the report to start with the framework, move to the report, but engage, significantly with those overarching recommendations. And then again, of course, we made, that was 9 recommendations, 8 recommendations, another 100 or so according to each of the pillars. I got the 1-minute warning about 30 seconds ago, so I don't think I have time to address any of those, but hopefully they will come out in our conversation.
Yeah, so we present the report to government. They're preparing a response. So the next step is for the government to respond back to us about implementation, and they will be consulting with some of us on that. And this slide just shows, again, that the work was really grounded in the communities we represent, the honor of our ancestors, our hopes for our children. So we thank all of you for being part of that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Oh, I was drinking from the thing.
That was the most on-time presentation I think I've ever given. And again, I'll give credit to Zilla for that because I wouldn't have done it myself.
Another round of applause, of course, for Zilla and Akwasi. So again, we'll have a short, we have about 20 minutes, and then the full panel will reconvene and we'll have a longer conversation. We have both some questions from the organizing committee as well as some audience questions that I want to raise, and then you'll have a much longer discussion. Of course, congratulations. I mean, June 2023, really congratulations for all that you did. It's truly tremendous. I can't imagine, I mean, June 2024, it was released. So that gave you 6 months at best. And the kind of coordination, the thinking work, the writing, the edits, the consultations, the synthesization, significant amount. I mean, that really is tremendous. And it's a phenomenal document, 114 recommendations, short, medium, long-term goals. I wanted to start by asking you to help us think about what the priorities really are. I know that you identified a snapshot of some of the key components of the framework, but in the best of worlds, if we think about short-term, medium-term, long-term, what would you highlight as the priorities? So if the minister says, Akwasi, Zilla, okay, 114, no, I can't do that, but tell me, what do we really need in order to at least get the ball rolling? What would that be? If both of you can reflect on that for us.
So for me, I think the overarching recommendations that Akwasi read really do capture a lot of what we're looking for, because they acknowledge Black people as a distinct people. They provide resourcing to actually get the information we need and to take action on it. And then I would say the social determinants of justice is also, I think, a high priority, because as the minister acknowledged, that's what brings people into the system. So they don't just get born as criminals. It happens through the school to prison pipeline. It happens through poverty. It happens through mental health issues that aren't addressed. It happens through lack of housing and all these other aspects. So I think the priority is to make this country one where people truly have equal opportunities. And then I think we will see a change in what happens in the justice system.
Yeah, I will say that the advocacy was strong for those overarching recommendations and the social determinants. Again, given the kind of portfolios that comes under the Minister of Justice and what's in the purview of the federal government, I think there were some ideas of where we might go. But again, we can't address the issues that we're looking at without those social determinants. I wasn't one that was comfortable with the kind of like, what can we do now? What can we do now? Right? Because like what can be done now can be undone very quickly as well. And it's, I recognize that government operates in a certain way. There are election cycles, there are budgetary cycles, etc. But this is the first time that this has been done on a national scale, right? And, my guess is with the way in which the political winds are blowing, it's probably not going to be done or updated anytime too soon. And so I think, the intention of some of us were to also, in addition to presenting recommendations that could be addressed in the short term, really get out, and this comes from the overarching recommendations and within the recommendations under each of the pillars, a very clear idea of what it is that needs to be done in a fulsome manner to address the overrepresentation of and experiences that Black people have within the criminal justice system, so that if they cannot be implemented in full now, they can be taken back off the shelf later on when some of those recommendations are undoubtedly shelved, as they likely will be. And it would essentially be a plug and play. Your question of where do we start immediately? That's a tough one, right? Because someone who is experiencing poverty, who has been kicked out of school, who is underhoused, is going to say housing. Someone who is being stopped repeatedly by the police and it's having an impact on their health and mental health, and they're ending up in the justice system, is going to say policing. Someone who is experiencing, so it's really hard to identify at any one of these areas. Again, and we'll talk about a little more the social determinants. The earlier you start, the less there is in the pipeline. But again, there are very real issues that are taking the lives of our people in this country within the system.
And yeah, why don't we pick up that issue of the social determinants of justice? And of course, that model builds on the social determinants of health and the significance of that model, especially during the COVID pandemic and beyond, the popularization of that as a framework for thinking about health. And in this case, for thinking about justice. And one of the things that we see in these social determinants of justice is that justice is more than just the criminal justice system. That true, and as outlined in the report, true systemic change must address housing, education, care, food, security, employment, and of course, income fairness, all of these things being seen as determinants of justice. Now, what's viable? I mean, how are we to think about these determinants of justice as a new approach, a way that we're going to popularize what justice is? Is it viable that this is a roadmap to start to think about these questions, that we can actually, that maybe in 10 years from now, those prerequisites, education, health, all of those things can be the ways that we think about justice? Is that viable?
Why don't I kick this off? So I think it can certainly be viable for anyone that's willing to listen to evidence-based research, because the evidence demonstrates, as and my aunts and uncles would say, that prevention's the better cure, right? And so we see the dollar amount, it ranges anywhere from 3 to 7, $1 invested in prevention, and that goes to like quite literally neonatal care, can have a $3 to $7 savings on the back end of systems, including the criminal justice system, right? The earlier we can intervene to address health, mental health, education, employment, the better. So anyone that's willing to listen from an evidence-based perspective should be able to buy in. folks that are less willing to listen to the evidence and more willing to follow the money should also recognize that I talked about a dollar savings, right? We're talking about this is the saving of funds that would be going into the criminal justice system itself. So this is this area of work generally, you know, everyone's an armchair criminologist. Everyone's got opinions on criminological matters. And they are hugely polarized, and they're only becoming more so. And so, you know, it is undoubtedly difficult to make our way through the noise. I will just say that, you know, in terms of the social determinants of justice, I started studying criminology now over 20 years ago, and I did much of my training here. And when I was studying here, I was taking courses in sociology, I was taking courses at OISE and outside of criminology as well. And it became very apparent to me about this prevention element. And I got to a point in my studies where I was like, should I be studying criminology, or should I be in education, or should I be focusing on child welfare? Because again, I'm addressing issues when people have come into contact with the criminal justice system often, as opposed to stopping them or preventing them from being there. So I'm taking up a lot of the air.
No, it's all good. I think that I would say the same, that I think that we are seeing the alternative if we don't pay attention to these things. I live in central Winnipeg, and every day there are people using drugs, there are needles everywhere. There are people sleeping in bus shelters. There are people smashing windows. This is what's happening. There's theft happening. Like my car got stolen, like my neighbor's cars got stolen. So that is what happens when you don't address those social determinants. So when you don't put the resources, you just pay for it somewhere else. So the prison system is very expensive. The cost of damaged property or loss to life or injuries from crimes being committed upon you is high. The social cost of not being able to let your kids play outside because there's needles. All these things take toll. And if we don't address them, this is a society that we're heading to having. And I don't think we want that.
And I want to address just one more thing here. Like, one of the things that the social determinants of justice recognize that I think we need to recognize as well is that, you know, we focus on, as we rightly should, racism and discrimination that occurs within the context of the criminal justice system. But we also need to recognize that Black people are overrepresented as perpetrators of certain types of crime. And those are the certain types of crime that come to the attention of the police. So not insider trading or, you know, sophisticated stock manipulation, right? But the types of crime that the justice system likes to focus on: street-based crime, drug-related crime, and then there are acts of violence, and then we can look at things like homicide. Homicide, very small portion of crime, very serious, of course, but they serve to justify. But we need to recognize this too. Yes, we have to address racism and discrimination within our justice system, but the social determinants of justice serve to reduce that overrepresentation in certain types of criminal behavior, but also the circumstances that Black people are disproportionately in that bring them into contact with the criminal justice system, behavior aside. So again, more likely to live in disadvantaged neighborhoods with high police presence. Kicked out of school means you're more likely to be on the street, right? Or lack of success. Unemployed, similarly less engaged in not only pro-social activities, but engaged with institutions that'll reduce your likelihood of coming into contact with the justice system. So there are two angles to the social, or at least two elements to the social determinants of justice part that need to be addressed. Part of it gets to behavior-related issues. And, you know, when we think about health and mental health, especially, those are true. But then also kind of the outcome in terms of life chances.
There were some very poignant stories that we got from youth that answered the surveys, that some of them were saying, I just wanted to play basketball. There was like nowhere to play basketball. And there were some youths, I think in Quebec and Montreal, that there was a park and it had basketball nets, but it was chained up, and they climbed over the fence and they were playing basketball, and the police came and arrested them because they were trespassing. So all they want to do is play basketball, they end up criminalized. So if we just provided a place for them to play basketball instead of criminalizing them for it.
Great, that's certainly important. And I wanted to now, we have some audience questions that I wanted to raise. One of them has to do with the coordination of entities and jurisdictions. And one of the questions that was asked is, what is the incentive for implementation, actually, especially now that much of the impetus from George Floyd awakening has waned? How do you see these recommendations from the federal level being implemented in coordination with the ministries across all levels of government, including public safety, community, social services? I mean, what are you envisioning? How will the negotiation of those jurisdictions and coordination happen? Did you have Do you have some preliminary thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we kind of addressed that in the sense of the evidence-based decision making and the fact that if the provinces and cities don't deal with this, they end up with not very desirable situations where they're having a lot of crime and they're having a lot of social unrest. So, say for policing, I know in Winnipeg, they're having some concerns because there's been a number of police shootings. I think we're on number 8 in the past year or something like that. Mostly Indigenous or racialized people that have been killed. So people are starting to ask questions, saying, "Well, wait a second, like this is a little bit much for this to be happening from one police force." So we had recommended national standards for policing. So that's something that's like I think it was either short or medium term. It isn't that hard to implement. They would have to get together and get some experts and get those recommendations. But if all police forces had to follow these national standards, that means less shootings, which I don't think anybody likes it when the police shoot someone. Even if you're a very strong police supporter, it's horrible for that officer to go through that. And their family to go through that. And the social cost of that is really high. So nobody really wants protests disrupting things all the time. So let's deal with that. So I think there are lots of, especially in the social determinants, there are lots of incentives for the provinces to do it because if they don't, they're going to end up spending more money.
Let me ask another question, and this one for Akwasi then, which is about the E word, elections, and not the American elections on November 4th.
Thank God we don't talk about that. You don't want to hear me on that.
No, I know. That's a whole other town hall. But with the reality of a federal election likely here in Canada next year, the potential for a change in government, how might having a Black justice strategy as a governance priority have an impact now and in the post-election period? And we're asking really for a nonpartisan. This is the question anyway that was posed by the audience, a couple of people in the audience. So what would the message be here around the urgency and benefit of implementing such a justice plan?
I think the urgency is clear, and it has been clear for decades, right? We've talked a number of times about deaths at the hands of the justice system. That can come from a shooting, but that can come in a number of different ways. There are a whole host of negative outcomes as well that we've talked a little bit about. How do we make this a priority? What do I think is going to happen when there's an election and the sitting government is perhaps not there? I think it's quite unlikely that a conservative government, and the conservative government it looks like we're going to get, is going to feel that it has is going to have feel that it has a major stake in implementing the recommendations that we've put forth. I think that identity politics are such, concerns around wokeism are such, approaches to dealing with people who are in conflict with the law, specifically, but in need more generally, are not aligned. We can see what the leader of the Conservative Party has been saying about drug users, right, and the approach that our drug strategy is likely to take, one which has thankfully taken a bit of a more positive turn in recent years. So I'm not super optimistic, super hopeful about what a change in federal government will likely mean for this work. I am optimistic that as I look around the room, we have this many eyes looking at me now. We have both had innumerable people reaching out to us, community and within government, to express their thanks for the work and their desire to understand how they can do more. And so I have no doubt that there will be people, often bureaucrats working within government, still trying to move pieces of this work forward as they can. And I have no doubt that my academic career and my advocacy career, and likewise for you, Zilla, will outlast this next government. And so I'm not too concerned about immediately what happens, again, providing that there is movement in the right places that will be undertaken in the interim. I do hope, though, as has been noted, and perhaps our subtitle should have been completed under ambitious timelines, that the government will be as swift in trying to implement what it is that we recommend or what they adopt that we've recommended as we were in getting the work done, right? I think that us having completed this in such a short timeline demonstrates that the work can be done swiftly if the attention and hopefully the resources are put to doing so.
And I think it's really important that we try to decouple this strategy and these goals as much as possible from party politics, because it is bigger than that. So I think whenever we're talking about it or having these discussions, that we really try to make it go beyond that, because it does go beyond that. And these are issues that have lasted through liberal governments, through conservative governments, They do not belong to any one particular party. They do not belong to any one leader. They are for everyone to address and deal with. And I think it's really important that we make that clear as much as we can.
So that's what a nonpartisan response looks
Okay,
like. I missed that lesson in
it.
school.
Love it. Here's the final question, and this is for the pessimists in the room. And this was asked by someone in the audience. Of course, and for both of you, we've already seen attempts at systematic and systemic reform of justice and policing. And of course, this has resulted in a focus many times on just addressing the low-hanging fruit, such as police trainings and retrainings. What would you say is different this time? Why should Black communities be optimistic?
Well, I think we had those very conversations in the steering group, and I think that's where the evidence-based decision-making came from, because when it comes to training, the research is very ambiguous about whether that type of training helps or not. So we recommended that we do some, but it's certainly not the main point, and it's not our main recommendation. It's not the focus of the strategy, because we recognize that this is a systemic issue. So I think this report is a little different in that it does dig into the reparative justice. I think we even talked about reparations at some point in our report, as in enslavement reparations. So going way back, that's why the framework went way back to 1600s and the first Black people in Canada. So we did try to take a very comprehensive look at systemic factors. Now, whether government will adopt that, we don't know that yet, but we have laid out a path for them to do that we feel is doable and can be resourced and can be achieved. And we can't make promises to the communities, obviously, but a lot of that is due to their advocacy and their efforts over time, and that is being heard, I think, more than it ever has been, whether it's George Floyd or whatever else. So it is being heard, and it is being taken up to the highest levels of government, and I think that is different than maybe in the 80s and 90s.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. And we have the opportunity to continue this conversation in the final half of the session, and I wanted to please join me in thanking both Zilla and
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'd like to call up Craig Wellington, the CEO of BOF, who will take on the moderation of the second half.
So again, and thank you all for being here and being a part of the discussion. I know there's a significant amount of people who are watching online. This is an important conversation. I think it is important work that we as Black Opportunity Fund are committed to. So it's more than just providing money. The community convenings, the advocacy work, it is a critical piece, we understand. Hearing the voices, again, hearing when we talk about these key issues, what tends to happen is the loudest voices are in the urban centers. What tends to happen is Ontario gets a louder voice. So it is important when we do these engagements that we bring in Zilla, who's coming in from Winnipeg, that we bring in Derico, who is in Nova Scotia, 7th generation African Nova Scotian, who's going to have a very different experience and context than you're going to have in Quebec, in Alberta, where Dunia is coming from, African Canadian Civic Engagement Council, where they're working there. So it is important that we recognize the need to have these voices all here present and speaking to this. So Derico and Dunia, I know I've left the room, but we'll be calling them up to come in. But again, the reason for this conversation, this important conversation that we've heard in the community, this tremendous amount of work has been done. But when we hear the conversations, I think the community needs to be engaged now. Yes, they were engaged before the recommendations, and we thought it is important to provide an opportunity for Akwasi, for Zilla, for the steering committee to hear the process, how communities here, how communities across Canada were engaged. Again, African Canadian Civic Engagement Council, led by Dunia, the CEO, is engaged in that, was involved in the community work. And it's an organization that we fund. We talked about Hood Farms. That's an organization that we fund out in Western Canada. African Nova Scotia Justice Institute was involved, and it is important today. And this is why we have them here, so you can hear their voice and the specific context. We have online another member of our National Justice Working Group, Dr. Myrna Lashley, who is calling in from Quebec and has done a significant amount of work in this space, and also working directly with public safety and so on, specifically around corrections as well. So we're going to hear some great context. So if I can invite Dunya Noor from African Canadian Civic Engagement Council. And I really want to give a big round of applause for Sister Dunya for the incredible work that she's doing now in Alberta, recent police shooting, and the wake of that, and the ongoing damage and trauma that is being done in Alberta. And I see Dunya at the forefront of that with the mother, talking to her, providing support, as well as doing the important advocacy work in the community. So we appreciate that. We appreciate that. Derico Simons, Africa Nova Scotia Institute, Justice Institute. Please come and join me, brother. I appreciate you. And again, these are individuals who have been, part of the work that we've done with our engagements with our Justice Working Group, and I see other members here of our Justice Working Group. And again, being on the call, and when we talk about the advocacy work, and then Derico comes on the call and he talks about his experience as a 7th generation, 8th. You drop our next one. Applause for that. Applause for that, brother. Again, and reminds us, one of our calls a year ago, and you reminded me that the most senior Black police officer in Nova Scotia was racially profiled at gunpoint, along with his wife, who's a lawyer, just 2 years ago, right? So they've been in Canada, in Nova Scotia, before there was a Canada, and are still told to go back where you came from, right? So it is a conversation that we have all the time, where, I hear people saying, well, I just got here, I wasn't part of slave. And I'm like, but you're coming into a society where it is embedded in the society. So you're inherited. It doesn't matter when you came. And we have on the line Dr. Myrna Lashley from McGill. Okay.
Hello.
I've heard of Okay, so Myrna, you can hear me?
I can hear you. Now I have to find and see you again, because I've been given full screen here, and I don't want full screen. I want to be able to see you.
Okay, well, we're glad you're here with us, Myrna, and a big congrats for Myrna, who will be taking her seat on the Order of Canada this year. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Now, okay, I want to get back to the gallery where I can see you, because I've got my face.
Absolutely.
I know what I look like. I want to see everybody else.
We'll get there, Myrna. And of course, I want to recognize Judge Pamela Appelt, who also has been named to the Order of Canada, and at the same time as Myrna Lashley. So,
congratulations, Judge.
So, I want to jump into the questions for the panel. And I'll go through each of you. So I'll start with you, Derico, and then I'll each member to come in from your own perspective, from where you're situated. What are your overall perspectives on the recommendations of the steering committee, the process, and your hope for immediate, midterm, and long-term priorities. Obviously, we've heard Akwazi and Zilla's. And how do you see the recommendations, again, being implemented on that national level, considering those realities and the differing identities in communities across Canada?
Sure. Is this my own? Okay. So I guess first thing that I would like to say is that I think that the fact that we have, and it's been acknowledged by the federal government, Canada's Black Justice Strategy, that to me is an acknowledgement from the federal government of the issues. And so I'm very grateful for the work that Zilla and Akwazi have done, certainly as well as the communities across Canada who've poured into this particular report. And you know, so when I think about immediate priorities, I think about how we get into the justice system. And from my perspective, and what I see in Halifax is through the police interactions. And so, yep. And so through the police interactions, and so I think that we have to take ways to look at creating accountability mechanisms for this actual strategy, because many reports, many things are just continue to be shelved, and if we're not staying on the pulse of this, then this could be another thing, and that would be a massive fail to the community. And so how can we then put in place accountability mechanisms, transparency mechanisms, so that we know exactly where we're at? I think that this needs to be a phased approach. Certainly when we're talking about implementing this nationally, we have to take into account, certainly we're all Black people, but there's many nuances amongst our communities, many different faiths amongst our communities, and how are we considerate of those particular needs on a national scale. I think one thing that I've been saying from the beginning is that for government, legislation is language. And so one of the things that I would say, whether that's short term or whether that's long term, how we look at it, I think that legislating this would then transcend change in governments. And so if this was in legislation, it's really hard to undo. And then I also think that there needs to be just general education on this particular strategy, because we have many people here in the room, we have many people online, but the broader Black community across Canada and then public in general would need to be educated on what these things mean. Because there's many things in there that people are just not aware of, or even particular parts in there that parts of the justice system people may not have been aware of. And so I think that whether it's a short-term or medium-term kind of goal is providing some type of public education just across the country, so that we have a baseline sort of starting place, baseline understanding amongst communities on what this strategy is, and then from there we can start implementing it. I think that, I also think that expanding the scope, and so in terms of what Akwazi and Zilla were talking about, is that all of the other sort of sectors that sort of feed into the justice system. And so if we're looking at just the justice system, we need to look at all the other sectors. And so expanding sort of the scope and reach within Canada's Black Justice Strategy. So looking at the education system, looking at poverty, looking at income, because those are sort of feeder systems into the strategy.
Excellent.
And there's just one last thing that I would like to add, is that some of these things can be done for free. And so if we're looking at, I'm sweating up here, but if we're looking at, it's good. But if we're looking at this particular strategy, we have to think about some of these can literally be done for free. It just takes some political inertia, it takes stroke of a pen. And so when I think about immediate actions, there are some things that people could literally just do by changing a particular policy or having a conversation with your colleagues. That would be like straight up immediate.
But we want money too. Junior, the same question for you. Immediate, midterm, longer term priorities and the specific context of where you're situated and how, in terms of looking at the strategy, and of course your organization was one of those who led consultations in, your overall perspectives on the recommendations and that national implementation and ensuring that regional voice.
Definitely. First of all, shout out to BOF, and thank you so much for having me here. I feel a sense of warmth and connection and kinship to each one of you, and I appreciate it. My brother Dorico here, I'm very familiar with his work, and we've worked together as well, so thank you for all you do. In terms of our interaction with the strategy, to be quite honest, it was a bit difficult simply because of where we're situated. You see, I'm a person of African descent who's located in the prairies, and anyone that understands the landscape of Alberta and being black on the prairies, it's a whole different ballgame. So what happens is, due to political, let me just go back a little bit. Let's tap into some of my ancestral connections. There's an African proverb, and it says, when two elephants fight, the grass pays the price. So what that means is Eastern Canada versus Western Canada, and where the alienation and isolation, and especially when black communities bear the brunt of that violence, and when we're going through one of the highest hate-motivated crimes, one of the highest homicide, and also disproportionate overrepresentation of incarceration of black people, but particularly black refugees and black immigrants and black religious minorities. And if we think that this idea of francophone versus anglophone, imagine communities that don't even speak English nor French, but they're black, or they're Muslim, or they're 2S LGBTQ queer communities, they're trans people, and this is who the justice system in Alberta targets. So we didn't have, to be quite honest, I am so grateful for the federal government of Canada simply because I believe that acknowledgement is a significant step, and that's part of the process. And the fact that you're acknowledged, your pain is acknowledged, we're talking about hundreds of years of enslavement and colonization and displacement and being stolen from your land, or for those that are located directly in the motherland, in Africa, no one understands the amount of resource extraction and the genocide and the culturicide and the displacement, such as my people, I'm a child refugee, and that's my experience of coming to Canada. So as my sister Zila said it so eloquently, or I think there was also someone else that said, we are stolen people that come to a stolen land, and it creates this dichotomy of confusion. To not take too much time, the strategy was difficult for us, is what I'm trying to say, simply because of the breach of trust and what we've been through. And when the government of Canada announced that there's going to be a Canada Black Justice Strategy, we were hopeful, we were thankful, we were grateful, but at the same time, we weren't sure if it's performativeness. And I'll tell you why, because a black man had to be murdered, and we were all vicariously traumatized for our government to have a reaction. It wasn't something that was strategically and intentionally through policy created for us. So what did we do? What we said is, at the beginning, and we have no problem rejecting money, believe it or not. As much as we want money, we're underserved, we're broke as could be. We believe that you have to be careful in where you take money from and the spirit that comes with that. So, thank you. So what we said is, we told, when the government of Canada Justice Department reached out to us, we said, let us read the framework, let us read the history. And we understood the decade, Canada being 5 years behind. I applaud the government, the new government, 2018, that adopted, implemented, and tried to resource the decade. And then from there on, that's when we read the terms of reference, we read the pillars, we read the framework, and it really aligned with us. And we said, yep, this is our way. And the key principle, the principle of restraint and justice and policing and Sankofa, and there was a component of African indigenous knowledge systems that was actually incorporated in this strategy. So that's when we said, okay, we think we can align. We do believe we just might be safe. And we did know some of the folks that were part of it, and we had this level of trust that perhaps they will protect us as well. However, even then, we did realize a significant proportion of course, the realities of Black Albertans and communities of African descent that was missing. So what I wanted to say is that what we did is, the first thing we did is we went to our elders. We have a wisdom keeper, and it's a bunch of various different elders, academics, women, healers, leaders in our community, and we said, should we take this? And we went through a cultural protocol, and the answer was yes. The second thing we did is we defined our own terms of reference, how we're going to not create and re-traumatize the people that we're going to interview. according to our contractual agreement with the federal government of Canada, we were supposed to interview 150 people through a focus group. We actually interviewed 250 people across Alberta. We went to prisons, federal penitentiary, and we specifically selected one of the most impacted group. What we said is, we want the Black Muslim women that have been disproportionately being attacked in our community. We want the Black men and the families of people, the families that lost their children to gun violence. We also said we want to hear from the Black 2S LGBT community, especially those that are asylum seekers. We went to Bowdoin Institute in Drumheller. If anyone here is from Alberta, you will understand that that's where the highest population of Black inmates are. And then we went to women that are also survivors of sexual violence. So we brought an intersectional and gender nuance specifically to the reality of what Alberta needed. And what was humbling in the process is the alignment, the connection, but as Alberta, we are the third largest Black population, and the exclusion and isolation is so real. And even in some of the things, like for example, when we talk about impact of race and culture, assessments, we also need to think about immigration and deportation and interaction with the criminal justice system. So that's what we added, and I know that we got amazing feedback from Sister Zila, Akwazi, and the Government of Canada. We're trying, but I hope that was concise enough. You might need to stop me talk.
Beautiful. And now over to you, Myrna. I would love to hear you again from the context of where you're situated in Quebec, where you have...
Well,
yes, please, Myrna.
First of all, I want to say thank you to Zila and Akwazi. Thank you very much for a job well done. I do have one slight criticism for you two, which is that you spoke to Montreal North, you spoke to Saint Michel, but you didn't speak to Anglophone Black people. What you got in Saint Michel and Saint Leonard in the North, you got French-speaking Black people. And unfortunately, the relationship, although it is much better than it has been between the English and French Blacks, it's not as good as it should be. It is better, but it's not as good. So you didn't get the perspective of Black people in Quebec, which is completely different than what you find within the French majority, because Quebec, the government of Quebec, has done to Black people what the federal government has done to Black people and Indigenous people. In other words, they've had a divide and conquer type of thing. So just as Black people and Indigenous people are scrambling for the crumbs that fall from the table of the federal government, we in Quebec, the Francophone and Anglophones, are scrambling for the crumbs that are falling from the table of the provincial government. So I just wanted to put that out there. In terms of, before I talk about where we go, it's going to be very difficult for Alberta and Quebec. I mean, you're absolutely right what you said about Alberta and Quebec. I spent some time in Alberta, and I don't want to do that again if I don't have to be perfectly frank. It was horrible. Quebec is a place where our government has said that there is no racism, there is no systemic racism. And if there is, it only applies to Indigenous people. So putting this plan in place, apart from the fact that we have a different, as you know, you're lawyers, you know, we have a different jurisdictional issue, we have a different legal system. You know, the civil code is certainly different here, the criminal code is the same, but that's all right. But Quebec uses the notwithstanding clause a lot. And it puts things in place whenever they don't like something, they pull out the notwithstanding clause. Now, if you accept that they have said that there is no systemic racism in Quebec and everything's fine, and if there is, it only applies to Indigenous peoples, This is going to make it very difficult. You've got to get through that. So one of the things I would say in the short term is that you have to mobilize the people on the ground, not people like me and you. We've got to get on the ground and get people mobilized to defend their own rights, because a lot of them have given up. They've just said, you know, we've seen report after report, nothing changes. So we've got to mobilize them, and we've got to stand with them to get them to take the bull by the horns and move forward, or it will not happen. In terms of CSC, the correctional system, some of you will know what the SIUs are. Those are the structured intervention units, and those were put in place to replace segregation units. I talk about isolation here. Now, we're supposed to be following the Mandela Rule, which says that no one should stay in there after 15 days, and that they're supposed to have 2 hours out every day, 4 hours out every day, 2 hours of meaningful human contact. But the legislation as it's written said they have to be offered. What CSC is saying is reoffer, but they're not taking it. The legislation does not say they have to take it or they have to be made to take it. But the last time I visited the jail, I visited Donnacona earlier this year up in northern Quebec. It's a maximum security. There, I only saw 2 black guards, and they were afraid to speak to me. But when the director and all the white people were gone, one of them came to me and said, look, if you ask me a question in front of the director, I'm going to say A, B, C, and D. I need you to watch my eyes to get the truth. I need you to watch my eyes. And if I wink or if I speak, you need to watch my eyes, because my mouth will say one thing, but my eyes will tell you something else. In terms of the SUVs, the SIUs also, I spoke to one black man in the SIU, and he told me that the guards, the white guards, were being quite racist to him. And I got that from the black guard also. They get into the SIUs, they're not taken out. I talked to the psychologist, and as you know, I am a psychologist. I talked to the psychologist, and I said, what kind of culturally appropriate interventions are you employing? And he said to me, well, I don't know what you're talking about. And I said, but you and I are members of the same psychological order here in Quebec, the corporation. The corporation have said that we have to take these things into account. He says, I'll call the corporation and ask them if what you're saying is true. So they are not getting appropriate care. The inmate told me that, the guard told me that. So somehow, and I don't want to take up too much time, because anybody who knows me know I can go on once I get on these things. Somewhere in this report, or in an adjunct in the regulations or something that we put in place for it, we've got to take those things into consideration. We can't leave it to chance, because we've been talking to CSC. Our latest report, for anyone who wants to read it, is up on the website. We put it up 2 or 3 days ago. Just go on the public safety website and you'll be able to read it. So there are a lot of issues in CSC that are not being attended to. They tell us they've got the parole people, the guards, CSC tell us we've got too much work. So we've got to address these things. I don't know if that answers your question, Craig.
Absolutely, Myrna, and I'm glad you're getting over your shyness. So next question I want to do is kind of a broad question about restorative and reparatory justice initiatives and the historical context of that. And I want to start with you, Dorico. Nova Scotia is just way ahead of everybody else in terms of African-focused justice initiatives. You are with the African Nova Scotia Justice Initiative, and there's been a lot of focuses or attentions on government-led reparatory and restorative justice initiatives. So I'd like your perspective on that, in particular the government-led ones.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, I think like the fundamental issue is that government is trying to be both the harmer and the healer at the same time. And there's a bit of an incongruence with that because you can't harm the community then propose to have the solution to the harm that you've caused. And so government, and I'll speak from, I guess, Nova Scotia perspective, from my own experience, is that government-led restorative justice, reparatory justice initiatives have disproportionately not served the black community. And so at ANSGI, we've seen data that they've provided that has shown that they have not served the black community. And so we're right now conducting research to actually develop our own Afrocentric restorative justice program for black people in Nova Scotia because the programs have not worked. And there are folks like, and actually even further to that, is that the same systems and people who have harmed black people, judges, crowns, police, are the only people who can make referrals to restorative justice. So you have to think about how strange that is. Because if I'm pursuing or if I'm chasing a black person and then I'm going to arrest them, I already have my preconceived notions or biases, and then I have to sit in my car and then refer them to restorative justice or not, given all of the, and so it doesn't actually make sense. And it also can explain why there would be a disproportionality in terms of referrals to restorative justice. Through IRCA writing, I get to see why police do or why they do not refer folks to restorative justice. And I get to see some of the disturbing things that they say about black people in terms of why they don't. And so government-led restorative justice hasn't worked for black people. Has it worked in general for others? Possibly. But it has not worked for black people for some of those reasons. Professor Michelle Williams in Halifax, there's a paper that she had written in 2013, A Change Gotta Come. And just an excerpt says that this paper demonstrates that despite the theoretical promise, restorative justice practices in Nova Scotia has not met the needs of African Nova Scotians, nor fundamentally transformed structural racism within the system. And this was in 2013. And even before the Dr. Scott Wortley report, which I just continue to point out the irony is that, and this is no shade to him, but we needed a white man to come and sort of say that these were the experiences for black people in Nova Scotia. White man from Toronto, to come to Nova Scotia. And even before that, we had Kirk Johnson. We had that report. None of those recommendations have been actualized. And so then when we fast forward to today and we think about the restorative justice and the reparatory justice initiatives, again, I would just end with saying you can't be the harmer and the healer. And it can't be just police, crowns, and judges who are able to make referrals to restorative justice. It doesn't make sense because we're here because of the historic harm that this same system has caused black people. And then we're expecting those same people to just make abundance of referrals. It's not going to work.
Dunia, over to you. Same question. Just in terms of that context about reparatory and restorative justice and the context and history and nuance.
Definitely. I would say maybe I could just start with a question of, and please raise your hand, how many of you are aware of the Truth and Reconciliation, Canada's Truth and Reconciliation? Okay, see a lot of hands up. How many are aware of the role that Africa played and African indigenous knowledge systems? I only literally see 3 hands, or 4. There's a reason why I'm saying that. Inherently, as black people, this is our ancestral knowledge. It's in our DNA. And if you look at the principles of restorative justice or reparation, what we need to think about is what's the harm that we're trying to repair, especially when it comes to at a systemic level. And I'll tell you from an Alberta context, we have a diversion program. There's a police diversion program. In 2018, 2019, we noticed the increase of black youth in like something as simple as what I would call crimes of poverty. They were serving time, they were being detained. And the question was, but hold on, this youth is a minor, first-time offender, and we're talking about theft under 5,000. Why did you right away choose punitive measures of incarcerating this youth? Because we all know of the institutionalization that takes place. You take our men, you take our youth, you take our women, you take them to prison, and somehow they learn survival skills and tactics because they're in a state of trauma, and then they perpetrate this violence back into our community. So you're actually making a criminal. This youth is not a criminal. So then what we realized from there on is we challenged in 2020 or 2019 to give us statistics data in terms of how many youth are actually going through the diversion program with Edmonton Police. And we literally realized that it's predominantly white youth from St. Albert. Anyone from here from Edmonton would understand St. Albert is in the suburbs. And that's when they say boys will be boys, but for young black boys, they're not boys, they're men. And so what we did is instead of relying on the government or the government to refer youth to us, we actually lobbied the provincial government of Alberta. We held the previous police chief accountable, and we made it public. This is what's happening, and this is how it's disproportionately impacting our communities. These are what crimes of poverty means, and of course education is a centerpiece to it, simply because as black people we're already seen as aggressors, so you have to be as kind as possible, as gentle as possible, as you have to speak as low as possible, and Alberta is really a different context. But what ended up happening is a lot of the parents would say, all of a sudden we're getting so many parents and communities and elders and youth themselves, all the way to adults, knocking our doors at the African Canadian Civic Engagement Council. This is my first charge. This is what happened. Whether it's miscarriage of justice or whether it's someone actually did do something that was a harm to themselves and others, what we immediately did is we developed our own process. What we immediately did is we attracted people that had the fundamental same values and spirit of protecting and preserving the lives and dignity and human rights of all people of African descent. What if I was to tell you that we all did this with zero money and zero support, and we rehabilitated our youth? To the point that Edmonton Police was so embarrassed, and they came back to us, thank you, and they said, you know what? We have a bunch of youth that we want to refer to you. So 2019, what happened? Edmonton Police Chief referred 25 youth who are black youth, who they would categorize as the most prolific youth. And I will be honest, I also want to have integrity as I share this. These youth were going through a lot of challenges. They were traumatized, they're living with mental health, they were unhoused. They were people that went through a lot of harm, that were perpetrating harm against others. And that included daylight shootings, by the way, of innocent people and civilians being collateral. And the police was so shocked when we said, okay, we don't have the money, but why don't you keep a data, since you're already surveilling our community and surveilling our youth, of now that you brought them to community, and then look at their trajectory of if they reoffend and relapse. We still have that data. It wasn't by us, because when we say it, there's a level of credibility issue. It was police that actually showed the decrease, and literally we have some of these youth right now that bought houses, they never reoffended. So the point is that we created our own program. And we had it for a long period of time. And every time we applied to government, our application would be rejected. Even though we had one of the top, I kid you not, if scholars in this room read what we wrote, you would be shocked. But then what ended up happening is, finally there were pushback and there was challenges, and the federal government of Canada supported us. I will be honest, unfortunately, our province is not there yet. The city is just trying, it's a baby steps, but the federal government of Canada was the first to support us, not in funding, but recognition, understanding that, wow, the black community in Alberta are doing good, this works. We have data, we have empirical data as well, we have scholars working with us, and matter of fact, we have data that came directly from the police. This is where I want to tie Black Opportunity Fund, because what happens as a community is we're pitted against each other, Eastern Canada versus Western Canada, and sometimes we're all fighting for the same small breadcrumbs, right? But the first time this program was ever funded to sustain, that's changing so many lives, was by the Black Opportunity Fund.
Thank you. Thank you, Sister Dunya. Very happy to support, and I'm glad to hear that the federal government is giving you support, but they need to give you money too. Myrna, over to you again in terms of just historical context, restorative and reparatory justice initiatives, how they've fared before, what are your concerns going forward this time, especially government-led ones?
I have to tell you that in terms of that, we're pretty good in Quebec. Quebec has really good social justice things in place. I mean, I can't say they don't. As a matter of fact, we don't, as a rule, send kids to jail. We try as much as we can to find other ways. We had juvenile diversion programs. In the hospital where I am, we have a diversion program. The police send them to us. We work closely with the police. I'm now on another committee with the police where we're actually going to be putting people into the cars with the police, looking at youth, but also itinerants. We're going to have mental health people in the car patrolling with the police. They're pretty good when it comes to youth. And we in Quebec, in mental health area, we're very careful about not labeling youth. We will not put a diagnosis on, a sticking diagnosis on a child under 18 years of age. Even if we think that there might be a touch of schizophrenia there, we will always say conduct this sort of, so give us the chance and the youth to turn things around. Where it's a little bit more problematic in terms is with first episode psychosis. Because when they bring them into us at the hospital, most of them are brought in by police. And when we interview them, we just published a paper on this. When we interview them, we find that a lot of the things that are driving the psychosis, it's not what people think it is. That it's racism very often that's driving it. They become so overwhelmed, they don't know how to cope. We make people lose their faith in front of their children. So what are we talking about? Restorative justice when we're holding up a man or a woman to be incompetent before their children. The same thing goes with, in the literature, you find a lot of people talking about, oh, it would be good if this kid had a father, and we make mothers who have raised their children and raised them well feel as though somehow they are beyond the pale. But we don't do that to white women. We don't do it to white women who decide that they want to have a baby without benefit of a father. We say, bravo, girl, you're so strong, we got you. But when it comes to Black women, we're quite happy to say, oh, well, if there was a father, this boy wouldn't have done that. And that's where we need help. We need to change the vision. And I'm hoping that something in this report will help us. I mean, I'm giving a talk on that in a couple of weeks about how we treat Black women. And the report doesn't specifically talk about women, I understand that, but we have to take into consideration that there's a fundamental difference in the way between Black women and Black men are seen. Neither one of them is good, don't get me wrong, but they are not equal. And if we're going to put this in place for restorative justice or anything else, we have to take into consideration those gender differences.
Thank you. What I want to do at this point is I want to bring Akwazi and Zilla to join the panel, and I will ask some further questions for the whole. No, Zilla, please. No, right here is good. I'll stand. Oh, cool. Cool. Yeah. So, and this one is for everybody on the panel. So, the greatest impediment to implementation of the Black Justice Strategy in the current social political environment and context, including this tough on crime environment that we're in? What are the greatest impediments, and how do we tackle those, if we can? Zilla, I'll let you take that first.
There was many. I think obviously lack of political will, but I think that where that comes from is a lack of education. So I think the reason that I think when we did the framework, we started with the history, and the history of Black Canadians is that that is still not known by so many people in Canada. There's still people today that don't think Canada had slavery. There's still people today that think, well, how many of you have heard, oh, well, it's better in the States than Canada for Black people? So we had an underground railroad. We don't know about all the people that got sent back, like Chloe Cooley. So the fact that this history is not there, and I know, like, for me, this past summer I went to Ghana for the first time. I was telling people about that earlier, and I went to two places, the Cape Coast Castle and Elmina Castle, which were places that enslaved persons were held before being transported to the Caribbean, to the States, to Brazil, to Canada, to serve as enslaved persons. And the criminal justice system was there. So they showed me one particular dungeon, and if a person, an enslaved person, rebelled and tried to get their freedom, they were thrown into this dungeon, and the door was closed, and there was no food or water put in there, and it's hot, right? It's Africa, it's hot, hot, hot. And they would leave them in there for about 3 or 4 days, and then open the door and find that they were dead and throw them in the sea and make sure everybody else saw that. So you learned not to resist and not to fight and to follow these rules and to put on these chains before you even left Africa. And that is what the justice system was for Black people. It was enslavement. It was, you stay on the plantation. You need a pass to leave. You can't marry who you want. You can't keep your children. You can't make money. You can't own property. You are property. And so understanding that that is where all Black people in diaspora started, that's why there's mistrust of police. That's why there are these issues that we have. This is why many people don't trust the government. And so I think understanding that this is why we're asking for reparation is because you owe us after all of that. This is the least you can do. The least you can do is to implement things like this strategy and try to address this anti-Black racism that you created. And so I think the barrier is that people don't understand that, don't know that history, don't know those stories. And so we need to tell them. That's what we need to do.
Yeah, thank you for that, Zilla. And I find that one of the most important, one of the most important things that we do, even with our communications and so on, is to provide education and context, because when you find how few people do understand the history. I remember being in the town of Oakville doing a presentation a couple of years ago, and I bring up, the 1921 front page of the Toronto Star. 75 hooded Ku Klux Klansmen burning a cross in downtown Oakville because a Black Canadian veteran was being married to a white woman. And the mayor of Oakville saying they're very much aligned in values with the Ku Klux Klan. But we don't know this. We don't know about Chloe Cooley. Paul Smither, who you mentioned. So I arrived in Canada 1980, and I ended up at the school where Paul Smither went to after he was let out of prison. So I was in Canada for 2 weeks, and Paul Smither is presenting about how he was put in prison. He was in Applewood in Mississauga, and the entire arena was chanting the N-word to him. Everybody in the arena. And what it led to is a fight outside where the captain of the other team died. And the judge specifically brought in medical experts who said the young man who died had nothing to do with actually Paul. In fact, there was no evidence that he had actually struck him. And the jury, all-white jury, still sent Paul to prison. So that was 2 weeks in Canada. And I was like, that was my lesson. The ref could have
stopped that
right?
before that, right?
Absolutely.
But the ref was like, I don't care. Like, call him what you want.
Absolutely. Akwazi, I want to turn it over to you. Same question. The current environment, social political environment, and the context, and I'll say in Canada, But it is more kind of this is a kind of a global movement in terms of the context that we're looking at and that tough on crime. What are the biggest impediments and how would you address that?
Well, I think the biggest impediment is the social and political climate in and of itself, right? One of the things that we know as people who study these issues and experience them is that pendulums swing back and forth. There's a tragic event, brings a large amount of attention to issues such as those captured in the strategy, and then time passes, time marches on, and that pendulum swings, and at times we swing further away. We're swinging in the opposite directions in some ways. But one of the things that I kind of want to flip the question a little bit in terms of what is it that we need, and this is something that has been brought up earlier, and this is why I'm so grateful that we're here today, is awareness not only about the problem, but awareness that the strategy actually exists, right? Like, we need awareness amongst members of the community, amongst policymakers, bureaucrats, politicians, that this very strategy even exists, so that those that can and want to can advocate for the implementation of the recommendations and utilize it in other ways.
Absolutely. And that's why we felt it was so important to allow you the opportunity to have the conversation, because there's so much misinformation out there about the strategy, about what it means and so on, to have that opportunity directly from you as opposed to through social media and so on. Dorico, over to you.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with what was said, and the thing that kind of comes to mind is somewhat the irony, is that this is led by black people, black communities poured into it, and then we have to fight for it to happen. Like, it's kind of strange if you think about it. And I think that one of the greatest challenges is actually that it's government led. Like, we have to depend on the government to do it, and it could, we just think about the history in terms of what the government has done to the community. So it is one of the challenges, and I say it's one of the challenges because of the political climate, because of the pendulum swing, and then also the fact that, like, black life has been politicized, and it's a wedge issue. It's things that governments use to sort of tout, look what we did, and then that makes it even more challenging, because an incoming government, the pendulum swings, they might not sort of see it the same way. And we get into a lot of trouble and difficulty when life becomes politicized in the way that it is. And so I think, again, one of the greatest challenges is that it is government-led because of the bureaucracy, because of the bureaucracy, and then also just because of the pendulum swing and the shift. And certainly, I think with some of the rhetoric that we may be seeing with potentially incoming, like, there could be some challenges with the strategy.
Dunia, over to you.
Yeah, it's definitely concerning, and I would echo what everyone is saying. I wholeheartedly agree, and just to add to that, I also believe it's more of an ideological perspective as well, simply because we know who's for us and for this plan, and we know who's not. However, it does shock me when I do see black people against their own interests. That part I don't understand, but the trauma must be pretty intense then. But what I'm going to say is, at the end of the day, to answer that question is, as a Canadian, I'll put it back on the Canadian government, Canada as a whole, in a way that it's not politicizing. Canada knows its history and what they've done to people of African descent. Enslaved Africans existed in Canada, and we see continuously how slavery shifted to the prison industrial complex system. And the truth is, Canada has this legacy, and it's up to Canada whether they will make the wrongs right. It's up to Canada, especially, like, I love the idea of acknowledgement, and I will always be grateful for the fact that we had a prime minister that acknowledged it, because acknowledgement and recognition is the first step. But the truth is, without implementation, as I mentioned, it's performative. And if this is not implemented, then what happens, all those stories, because as we're aware, that stories are sacred. People had to go through extensive trauma triggers to share what they've been through. And I'm sure that there's a lot of documents that stated the same thing. So again, it will directly impact Canada's reputation and where Canada stands with the world, and if Canada is truly honest about the International Decade of People of African Descent and its commitment to acknowledgement, justice, and development. And any digression from that is a human rights violation, and I give that to the Canadian government.
Myrna, I'll turn it over to you, and then following this, knowing how time is, I will just give it to everybody for a 2 minutes kind of summary in terms of what is your closing thoughts. But Myrna, over to you.
I would take issue with one thing that was said, which is I do not believe that Canadians know their history. They really do not. My daughter was born here, went to school here. She was taught nothing about Black people in Canada. And what she learned from me. I even tell my students sometimes, you know, I'm teaching and I tell them, look, we're all white. I'm teaching you white stuff. I'm doing the best I can, but I'm teaching you what I know. I have to do a lot of work here to make sure I don't teach you stuff that's not in your best interest. And I teach doctors, for God's sake. That's what I'm teaching. And I tell them, look, because they don't know. I had to get a Tintin parmi les sauvages taken out of my daughter's school. They thought this was good literature for a child. They had my child saying some crap about little black Sambo running around a tree, and you know, and they thought this was a good song to be teaching children. They do not know their history. That doesn't mean I give them a pass, because at some point you have to take some responsibility for what you're doing. But again, because we don't teach well, we start the social determinants of health and mental health at that age. So that then, because the kids learn to internalize that self-hating that they've been taught is acceptable. Another thing, last thing I want to say about this strategy is we implement it, and you're going to try to get the grassroots involved, is that we have to employ the African concept of Ubuntu. You know, we have to do it. Otherwise, we're going to be constantly crabs in a barrel. And you're doing better than I am, and I got to pull you back down. If we can get it through our bloody thick heads that when I do well, you do well. When you do well, I do well, we do well. Then we have somewhere to go. We've got to stop. Ubuntu forever, as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you, Myrna. Thank you. So again, I'm going to go around, 2-minute round. Everybody, just what are your closing thoughts?
Thank you very much. I'm going to say before I close, thank you again for organizing and hosting and for being here. I might have sounded a little more pessimistic than I usually do. It's just been a long day. I'm forever the optimist. And as I tell my students, I teach a course on inequality and criminal justice, and we start off talking about social constructionism. Race is a social construct, right? Crime is a social construct. Our laws are socially constructed. Race as we know it now, the way in which we define race, we understand race, and we categorize by race is a phenomenon that's just several hundred years old. We have created the problems that we see now, and we can do the work, the reparative work that we need in order to get us to a much better place. It may not happen next week, it may not happen next year, it may not happen next decade, but we need to continue down the path that we are on in order to make and not only envision, but engender the world that it is that we want to see. And I'm going to stop there because that was much more positive than anything else I might say. Thank you.
I would say that my ancestors picked the baton up and carried it as far and as fast as they could and put it down for me to pick up. And so at this particular moment in time, like, I think it's a very pivotal moment where we could have a paradigm shift in terms of the ideologies, the social impact, and whatnot across Canada for the Black community. If this is implemented in its entirety, I think it must be done in phases. It's not going to be simple, but it's also not impossible. And so I think that there's a moment where we, as a community, and then as a government can pick this baton up and run with it as far and as fast as possible for the next government, for the next generation to pick this up. I really think that the document that is created is very pivotal and can really shift, but it has to be implemented. It can't be one of those things that sits on the desk, and it would be a real shame, a tragedy actually, if all of the stories, all of the pain, all of the hurt, the knowledge and time that Black people put into this does not get implemented. It'll be a shame. It'll be a failure to the community. And so there's a real opportunity, I think, to really stand on business, to be honest, to stand on business and to make it happen. You know, we either do it or we don't. And if we do, great things can happen.
I guess I just wanted to start off by thanking the Black Opportunity Fund for hosting this especially important conversation in terms of times of uncertainty. Each one of us here today, we all have our own personal agency, and I think we could make a difference. And those that are online and those that are physically here, what I would encourage you to do is write to your local MPs, write to the Prime Minister, and don't let this go. Be resilient and resist like our ancestors did in terms of anything that violates or discounts or dehumanizes our experience. And I'm gonna leave you with this. It's another African proverb. If you think you're too small to make a difference, sleep in a room with a mosquito.
Oh, I'm so stealing that.
So one thing that is unfortunate about Canada being such a big country, I think, is that Black communities in Canada, we have not really recognized or taken our political power. We have a lot more of a voice, a lot more power than we realize. And I heard what my sister here said about being on the prairies and being isolated from many of the other centers. I have the same experience. So too often in Canada, when Black people are being discussed, it's Toronto, maybe Halifax. So we as a community are not utilizing our resources from coast to coast to coast, because we have amazing work being done in Alberta, we have amazing work being done in Saskatchewan, we have amazing work being done up north, BC. It's not all in Eastern Canada. And so I think the more we realize that we as a community have a national voice, and that's the amazing thing Black Opportunities Fund did tonight, is to bring that together into this room, because the community that we're building here is our greatest strength. And that's what we're building for our children and for their children and for the generations coming after us. So I think it's really important that we keep this momentum and know who we are as a community, as a people, that we have people we can reach out to all across the country, and to include everybody, all the voices, the 2S LGBTQ Black voices, the Black trans voices, the Black Muslim voices, the Black Jewish voices. All of these communities exist in us. We are very diverse and a very powerful and a very strong community. So I thank you all for being part of that tonight.
Myrna, you get the last word. Everybody brace yourself.
I'm a good person. Listen, one of the things I would like to see is, and it's following on from what Zilla just said. Thank you for saying that. We don't take our political space. You know, get on school boards, run for election. You may not win the first time, it doesn't matter. Run for election, present yourself, because you see what the other so-called minority groups have done. You know, and you know, you've got groups that say never again, and you've got groups that say truth and reconciliation, and they're all right, they're all correct. But what they've done is they've taken their political space. They run for elections so that governments don't dare say no, because they have a political power. They have to negotiate with them. We don't do that. We sit back and we say, them ain't like me not like them neither. And that does not help, because what that does is we play into the hands and we say, look me here, take my soul, you do whatever you want to do with me, because me not do nothing else so I need us to take our place. You've got on your stage right now, you've got three important black people sitting, 4 important black people sitting here. And you've got a
You left me out.
semi-important one. Five, okay. And you've got
Me and
a
Ekwazi get me.
semi-important one here talking at you. We can't do it alone. You can't just sit there and say they will do it. You want it done? Get up off your BR and come and help us. We will work, but you
Woo!
will work with us.
All right. On that note, I wanna thank you all for being part of the conversation and this very important convening. Those of you online, we see you, we feel you, and thank you for those of you who sent in questions in advance that we got to. I want to thank all the members of the panel, Myrna Online. Please, everybody, give a round of applause for this important conversation. Yes. And we will be having a reception outside, which has been hosted by UVic. And I want to thank the University of Toronto team, the various departments that have all listed here who have supported this, Canadian Race Relations Foundation, for all the work you do behind the scenes and in front of the scenes. And yeah, I think let's just keep this conversation going. I think what this conversation was an important show of force to say that this matters, that this strategy matters, for us to say this is a priority for the community, and we will follow through. And Dr. Myrna has talked about some ways we can follow through to ensure that there is some pressure for implementation, so this does not just sit on a shelf. And we have to change the paradigm and, you know, let them stop talking about race. The problems we're having are not about race. They're about racism. That's very different. It's very different. And we have, if we change our focus, then we can change the strategies and the outcomes. And again, this is a non-partisan issue, because we've been dealing with this foolishness for a long time, and it don't matter which government is in power. So this did not start with any one government. This is a long-term thing that has to be implemented over time. And we look at the rationale for why. And many of the things that we talked about, I mean, Ekwazi, what you talked about is data, stats. An investment in this is going to save you money down the road. That means, that resonates with any government, right? It's dollars and cents. This makes no sense. It costs less to send somebody to university than to incarcerate them, okay? So we have to change the narrative. Let's keep going. Thank you all for being here. May you all grow beautifully where you are planted.